I'm going to tell you the story of how I became an antique dealer. I'm stating as much directly because it's going to sound like I'm talking about a role-playing game, and a badly written one at that. You might think that I'm exaggerating, but there were classes, perks, quests, loot, larger-than-life characters, and even warring factions of a sort. All of that was invisible to most people, but anyone who knew how to look for it could find an entire world wherein hidden treasure, arcane symbols, and whispered legends were elements of everyday life. You could meet anyone from a smuggler to genuine royalty there, but the most unbelievable part was that selling stuff to shopkeepers was completely normal. I fell into that world by accident, and thanks to the friends that I made, I got to explore it from several perspectives at once. What's more, I can show you how to get there. And if you're curious, observant, and just a little bit lucky, there's a chance that you can bring back a souvenir. I'm Ramses the Pigeon, and this is the story of how I became the Silver Butcher of the Vale. Adventures in games usually start with a person creating their character, and it turns out that real life is pretty similar. I was an editor who'd been out of steady work for a while, and I'd been taking just about any gig that promised to pay me. Most of my time was spent in front of my computer, either grinding through a job or looking for my next one. So in order to keep me from becoming a complete shut-in, my wife made me promise to take at least one walk a day. That was fine, but there was really only one place for me to go. Up the hill from our apartment was a village-like section of the city that had been there for well over 100 years, and it had somehow retained its small-town atmosphere. Whenever I'd wander through, I'd overhear locals either bartering or sharing the latest gossip, and I'd see storefront displays that were decorated for the season. It was interesting, but I didn't pay a whole lot of attention at first. I was more intent on getting to a nearby thrift store, because I'd discovered that they frequently sold brand new production equipment for giveaway prices. Looking through those shelves became a daily activity, and my wife Josephine would come along with me on weekends. That was how we met the Silkworm. You might have noticed that I'm using some ridiculous nicknames in this story, but I didn't come up with them. In fact, Silkworm isn't even a nickname. It's one of those classes that I mentioned. See, in thrift stores all over the planet, you'll run into people called pickers. They're basically bargain hunters who look for things that they can sell at a profit, and while some of them work exclusively with specific buyers, most are independent agents. Either way, pickers can range from casual to professional, and when they start to specialize, other pickers assign descriptive labels to them. Silverbugs and goldbugs go after silver and gold, respectively. Crickets focus on music. Locusts buy up stuff to scrap, and dung beetles grab absolutely anything that seems like it's underpriced. I could go on, but you've probably caught the theme by now. These titles can be either affectionate or derogatory, but Silkworm is almost always the latter. This particular Silkworm was named Ken. He was a near-permanent fixture of the thrift store that I liked to scour, but he almost never bought anything. Instead, he'd mostly hang around and spin yarns, and he was clever enough to make them believable, at least if you didn't know any better. Ken also liked to wind people up, so if he figured out that you were a firefly, for instance, that's someone who collects uranium glass, he'd tell you that one of those green things had been purchased right before you walked in. His catchphrase was, "You just missed it," and when he wasn't lying about precious objects, he was hiding them in one of his stashes. We'll get to those later on, though. Ken first approached me while I was looking at a wooden statue, and he introduced himself by telling me that it was actually a sacred idol. Needless to say, I was a bit skeptical, but the more that I listened, the more plausible it seemed. According to Ken, similar figures had been made hundreds of years ago, and a few of them had wound up in private collections. Since they didn't appear to be valuable, they were some of the first things to be tossed whenever one of the collectors passed away, but a savvy picker could see them for the priceless artifacts that they were. He finished by telling me that he could have sold an identical piece for thousands of dollars, but that he'd given it to a museum instead. I didn't end up buying it, but that was mostly because Josephine stepped in. She'd been listening to the lecture, and as soon as Ken moved on, she whispered to me that he was flat out wrong about the statue. After a bit of internet sleuthing, she showed me that it was actually a mass-produced piece of decor from the 1970s, and not at all the sort of thing that any museum would want. The thing is, she hadn't needed to check. She'd only done that for my benefit. When I asked her how she'd known, she told me that genuinely old things just feel a certain way, almost as if the accumulated years had built up like a static charge. I must have looked skeptical again because she reached past me, grabbed a piece of brass, and said, "Here, this is old." It would be nice if I could tell you that I immediately understood, but in all honesty, all I could see was a weird candle holder. There was a quality to it that I couldn't quite explain, though, and since it was only $5, I decided to take it home with me. That single purchase would end up completely changing the course of my life, although I wouldn't know that until a month or two later. The next few days were uneventful. I went back to staring at my computer, I took more walks to the thrift store, and I learned to avoid Ken if I was in a hurry. At the same time, my wife's cryptic lesson kept echoing in my head, and I started to look at more than just tripods and lights. Josephine noticed the shift in my behavior, and she suggested that if I was interested, I could visit the antique shop on the hill. I could even bring my candle holder, and maybe I'd learn a bit more about it. The following morning is when the adventure began. If you've ever been to an antique shop, you might have an idea about what they're like, but this one was something special. You wouldn't find things like spinning wheels there, and the only old iron was being used as a doorstop. When you walked in, you'd be surrounded by centuries-old tables and display cabinets, and each one would be packed with mesmerizing objects. There were silver tea sets, gilded picture frames, ancient vases, and lamps in every design that you could imagine. It was as if someone had managed to collect the most spellbinding items from the whole of history, then arrange them so that they looked like they belonged together. Truth be told, it could be a bit overwhelming, but it was also one of the most inviting places that I've ever been, and that was entirely because of the men who worked there. The shop was owned by a guy named Denis, but nobody ever pronounced it correctly. He was about 70 years old with a perfectly tailored wardrobe, a twinkle in his eye, and a well-known love of sweets and seafood. Not at the same time, of course. Ken described Denis as a spider, but everyone else saw him as the neighborhood's grandfather. Folks would stop by just to chat or drop off cookies, and Denis would make everyone feel welcome. If they were there to buy something, he could almost always find exactly the item that they wanted. But if they were only coming in to look around, he'd let Carl take over. Carl could have been a comedian. In another life, he'd been a producer, a director, a designer, and a teacher, and he'd been successful at all of it. He could talk about any subject that you brought to him, and if he wasn't already a legitimate expert, he'd become one within a week. A few different events had combined to bring Carl into the shop, but to hear him tell it, he'd just walked in one day then forgotten to leave. He referred to himself as a perpetual student, but his nickname was the Eye Candy. That was because what Carl had in brains, he had in body too, and he didn't dress like an antique dealer. Tight shirts and flamboyant glasses were more his style, which may have been why the optician next door frequently used him as a model. Between him and Denis, that cluttered museum was kept as a hub of the village, and I couldn't have asked for a more perfect place to start my journey. What I didn't know was that it was also a fortress in a battleground, and I was choosing a side. I'm getting ahead of myself, though. The shop was still opening for the day when I got there, meaning that Carl was still arranging and rearranging the outdoor display. I was going to wait for him to finish, but as soon as he saw my candle holder, he dropped everything to greet me. We traded a few pleasantries before he asked me directly if I was there to sell something, and when I told him that I just wanted to learn, he invited me inside. I know now that if I'd said yes, he would have passed me off to Denis, but since I'd said no, he'd decided to talk with me himself. Over the next several minutes, he pointed out various details of the candle holder, although he started by telling me that it was actually called a chamber stick. The combination of the way that the brass had been worked, the presence of a wax hole, the style of the drip pan, and the overall construction meant that it had likely been made in about 1790, and I suddenly felt terrified of dropping it. Carl could clearly tell because he laughed out loud, reassuring me that while it was certainly old, it was also a pretty common item. Not junk by any means, but not something that I had to treat like a soap bubble either. We talked for a while longer after that, and I learned more about candlesticks, chamber sticks, and candelabra than I would have previously thought possible. I also learned about objects called pricket sticks. They're liturgical candlesticks with spikes instead of sconces, and I'm bringing them up like this because I'm bad at foreshadowing. That very evening, Josephine and I drove around to a few different thrift stores, and I just happened to find a gilded pricket stick. I brought it into the shop the next day, showed it to Carl, then made my first sale to Denis. Carl's exact words were, "That was a good trick, but can you do it again?" He taught me about old Sheffield plate next, and I came back with a coffee pot. After learning about silver hallmarks, I came back with a tankard. Most of that was dumb luck, but nobody called me out on it. In fact, Carl even joked that I was only pretending to be a picker, and he playfully accused me of dipping into a secret collection. Completing each quest got me a monetary reward, but the education that I was earning was far more valuable. Josephine started finding things too, and we garnered the collective nickname of the couple. We'd go out picking in the evenings, then visit the shop on Saturdays, trading thrifted treasure for coins and experience. Denise said that we'd caught the bug, but from my point of view, it was more like I was being cured of one. I'd been spending hours on sites like LinkedIn, and I'd been numbed by all of the noise that dominated them. Scrolling through social media felt like dumping time into a rigged slot machine with only one reel, and even if I hit the jackpot, it wouldn't make up for what I'd already lost. Success in picking was still random to some extent, but it was also dependent on skills and knowledge, and even if I didn't win, I still came away with a bit more of both. About a month into all of that, Carl approached me with an offer. It seemed like just another visit to the shop until Carl shared something exciting. He had recently made a once-in-a-lifetime purchase of an entire research library, a collection of antique books about antiques, but it was located in a town that was 8 hours away. He needed someone to ride out with him, then help safely pack and load everything, and he was happy to pay for the assistance. The gigs that I'd been working were often more hours for less compensation, and they certainly weren't as interesting, so I eagerly accepted. An account of that trip could be either a buddy comedy or a horror movie. We set out at 7 in the morning, and we didn't get back until almost the same time the next day. There were fires, near misses, veiled accusations of identity theft, last-minute victories, and enough books to fill 2 SUVs. Keep in mind that we started off with 1. It's a story for another time, but the part that's relevant now is what Carl explained to me on the drive. Again, it'll sound like something from a role-playing game, but there really were some surprising similarities. See, while the classes that I listed can serve as descriptive shorthand, some of them say a bit more than others. Certain silverbugs are fine with selling dented pieces of sterling to scrappers, whereas others insist on always keeping the objects intact, even if they can't sell them at all. Basically, different pickers have different alignments, and all of them fall somewhere on the spectrum between profit and preserve. The same thing goes for dealers, but in order for anyone to make an informed decision, they need to know what they have. A dented vase from the 1700s is worth far more than its constituent silver, but a vase from the 21st century might cost more to restore than anyone would pay for it. Some research about that can be done online, but a lot of the relevant knowledge hasn't made its way onto the internet. Moreover, there's so much misinformation out there that reliable sources are absolute necessities. That's where the books come in, and it's where leveling up really begins. Almost every picker starts as a novice. Think of it like having a single empty bookcase. As they grow more experienced, the shelves get filled, both figuratively and literally. Books and bookcases cost money though, so in order to keep advancing, the novice has to be selective about what they buy and sell. Curating a collection of objects helps too. It's like a library of comparisons, a bank of physical wealth, and a sign of expertise all rolled into one. If this were a card game, a picker's collection would be their deck. What they find, what they keep, what they sell, and what they scrap helps define their class and alignment, and those end up influencing how they progress. For example, employees at a thrift store might give special treatment to earnest collectors, but a locust could end up being shunned or even banned. On the other hand, that same locust could get better payouts from scrappers, so dealers might offload damaged merchandise to them. Those perks and pitfalls played a role in how pickers planned their routes too. Denis was often the first stop for anyone hoping to make a sale. He was notorious for having the highest standards in the region, but he was also honest and helpful. Other dealers specialized in things like pottery or furniture, so if Denis didn't want something, he'd recommend another buyer. Outside of the dealers and the scrappers, there were rumors of anonymous collectors, and there were also the 3 auction houses. One of those only took high-value items, another would take almost anything, and the third was probably a front for money laundering. But again, that's a different story. As for sources of stuff, there were a dozen or so thrift stores in the area, a weekly flea market, 2 junk shops run by dung beetles, and a handful of second-hand boutiques that mainly sold overpriced clothes. It wasn't really possible to make the entire circuit in a single day, so most pickers kept predictable schedules for searching and selling. They were usually polite if they crossed paths, but to say that things could get tense would be like calling the ocean a bit damp. Carl told me that if I was to become a dealer, I'd have to navigate all of those relationships and intricacies. We were already about 3 hours into our drive when he said that, but it took me a while longer to realize that I was being interviewed. It was still a casual conversation between friends, but it was also a test of whether we'd be able to work together full time. Carl was assessing my priorities, and he was also making sure that I knew what I was getting into. You remember the battle that I mentioned? Well, it wasn't as simple as something like scrappers versus dealers or pickers against each other. There's a second side to the game, and a second axis to a person's alignment. As far as I know, there aren't any alliterative labels for that one, although I did hear testify and falsify. Since antique dealers trade in physical pieces of history, it's essential for them to know and share relevant facts. The stories and the conversations matter almost as much as the objects, and all three need to be authentic. Trying to fake anything, whether it's an item or an interaction, is antithetical to the entire endeavor, and it's also a great way to ruin a reputation. Carl didn't tell me this next part directly, but it was easy enough to infer. Working with certain pickers or dealers can alter how a person is perceived. None of this is definitive and it's kind of taboo to talk about, but everyone has a decent idea of other folks' alliances. The sentence, "Oh, you work with Denis," was almost always said with a smile. I experienced that for myself, and it was because he and Carl were known to be friendly, fair, and focused on helping people find things that they would sincerely cherish. They were paragons of the testify side. Not everyone liked them, though, especially not when their honesty made life difficult for less scrupulous types. It wouldn't be accurate to call them forgers. That would imply some level of effort. They were more like silkworms who weaponized ignorance, and not just that of their customers. Unlike Ken, these individuals actually bought and sold things, and whenever it suited them, they'd act like they were clueless. One of their standard moves involved sweeping through a thrift store, accidentally switching around some price tags, and pretending to be naive about what they were buying. Later on, they'd market silver plate as sterling, vintage as antique, and flat-out fake as genuine. And if anyone caught them, they'd either feign innocence or lash out. If it sounds like I have a specific person in mind, it's because I do. I never heard her legal name, but pickers called her the Fish. Ken claimed that she'd garnered her nickname because she was slippery, and a locust that I knew said that fish was short for silverfish. There was also a vague anecdote that involved a scale-like necklace, but I was never clear on the details. Regardless of her nickname's origin, she and her mother ran a second-hand store in a neighboring town, and although they claimed to be affiliated with a local charity, it was an open secret that they just used the foundation's name. Since they never bought from pickers, they only took donations, they rarely had anything that collectors would want. And when they did have something, they'd either price it so high that nobody could afford it, or send it off to an auction house. The rest of their merchandise was mislabeled, mass-produced, or both, so after someone had been there once, they usually didn't go back. According to the Fish, though, she wasn't the problem. The problem was any dealer who didn't peddle in falsehoods. Us against the customers was the philosophy for the falsify side. If they could trick a tourist into thinking that a brand new piece of tin and glass was an antique example of silver-wrought jade, it meant that they'd won. To hear them tell it, collectors were all greedy elitists who were trying to swindle hardworking shopkeepers, so the only way to stay in business was to unknowingly commit fraud. Don't ask me how that works. They gave the rest of the industry a bad name, and the Fish wasn't even the worst of them. There was a dealer named Richard who would barter with fakes instead of giving pickers cash, and when those pickers found out, he'd claim that they had tried to hoodwink him. Guess what his nickname was? He would also badmouth other dealers, especially if they offered to authenticate things. As far as he was concerned, anyone who told the truth was aiding the enemy, and that made them an enemy too. Fortunately, the part of the battle that I saw was mainly fought with information, and the testify side was more than happy to share it. When I had brought my chamber stick into the shop, Carl had treated me like he would have anyone else. I'd kept coming back though, and a week after our road trip, I was offered a job. When I first started writing this, I asked Carl and Denis if they would be okay with me talking about them in a video. They both said yes, but there was a caveat. During this intermission, I'm required to tell you the embarrassing anecdote of my first nickname. Josephine and I together were the couple, and I would eventually become the Silver Butcher, but that would take the better part of a year. At first, I didn't have a title of my own, at least not until after I made a complete fool of myself. The whole thing happened because I jumped from being a picker to being a dealer before I'd had a chance to specialize, so I was essentially still a novice. In order to feel like I was actually earning my paycheck, I committed to learning everything that I could about at least one type of object a day. Carl and Denis were happy to teach me, and I was frequently given books as gifts, but I wanted to supplement that with my own studying. Since I come from a family of metallurgists and since I've always loved silver, that seemed like a great place to start. Well, as fate would have it, I was quickly given the chance to test my expertise. A regular customer brought in an item and asked if we could identify it for her. Since it was made of silver, Carl and Denis encouraged me to take over, and I started sharing what I knew. Silver objects are almost always stamped with symbols called hallmarks, and if the stamping was done in London, one of those hallmarks will be a leopard's head. Up until 1821, that leopard's head was wearing a crown, so the design on its own is already an indicator of age. That isn't what I told the customer, though. I correctly dated her piece to 1810, but instead of saying crowned leopard's head, I said jester. It was oddly fitting because Carl and Denis burst out laughing. I quickly corrected myself. I knew that it was a crowned leopard's head, but I'd always said jester when talking with Josephine. Maybe it had been nerves or maybe I'd just been overexcited, but either way, the bad habit had come out at the worst possible time. My explanation didn't matter either, and the damage had been done. Thanks to my slip of the tongue, the reaction that it had caused, and the customer's delight at the whole situation, word quickly spread beyond the shop, and I became the jester. That was my name from then on. But I'd eventually earn another one. By now you have the lay of the land. Pickers of every sort dig through thrift stores and flea markets, then sell their finds to scrappers and dealers. The scrappers melt things down, the dealers move things along, and customers are connected with items that are given new homes. There are some bad actors in the world, but they can usually be avoided, and even silkworm threads occasionally offer insights. Knowledge helps to load the proverbial dice, and collections are decks of cards. That's obviously a simplified description, but it captures the game fairly well. At least until you start playing as a dealer. All metaphors aside, working at an antique shop is kind of a unique experience. There's the usual routine of setting up, unlocking doors, and making sure that everything's clean, but the time between opening and closing is never predictable. I have stories upon stories that I could share, and they range from being slightly hard to believe to being downright absurd. When I was first starting out, though, the most surprising part was the shift in perspective. For one thing, pickers whom I'd previously seen as competitors became potential suppliers, and from their points of view, I suddenly had inside knowledge about what Denis might want to buy. That led to another shift in perspective when I realized that my impressions of certain people had been completely wrong. There was a woman called the linebacker, for example. I don't know much about football, but I'm pretty sure that her nickname was a misnomer. She was about 60 years old, average height, stocky, and always dressed like a middle school geography teacher. When we'd first crossed paths, I'd assumed that she was a force to be reckoned with. She would wait outside of thrift stores just before they opened, then crowd her way in and sprint past everyone else. Within seconds, she'd be carrying armfuls of stuff, usually taken from the silver plate section. The next few minutes would see her strutting through the aisles, turning things over, and either adding to her haul or leaving things behind. And when she'd finished a lap, she'd find a quiet corner and stare at her smartphone. Before I started working at the antique shop, the linebacker never so much as made eye contact with me. That changed within a week of my first day. I don't know how she'd heard about my newfound employment, but I'm suspicious that Ken was involved. In any case, she tried to act like she was taking me under her wing, playfully quizzing me about whatever she had picked up. She wasn't exactly subtle, and unfortunately for her, I had no idea what I was doing, but it turned out not to matter. Almost everything that she asked about was so obviously junk that even a novice like me could tell at a glance. The law of averages occasionally worked in her favor, but the facade had been shattered. Despite presenting herself as being a refined, matronly expert, at least when she wasn't imitating a freight train, that woman might have been the worst picker in the city. By the way, if she sounds familiar to you, you aren't alone. It turns out that someone eerily similar shows up in thrift stores all across the globe. Some versions of her are more composed or aggressive than others, and her male equivalent is a guy who acts like he runs a seedy nightclub. But in either case, that person dashing around and snatching up garbage is not so secretly the local laughingstock. Of course, they aren't in on the joke, so when I was talking with the linebacker, I had to be careful about how I appraised her finds. It was good practice, though, and I was able to apply some of that discretion when speaking with people who wanted to sell things. That's a dance of its own, and it's more complicated than it sounds. Folks often think that old automatically means valuable, and they're shocked when they learn that their grandmother's cookie tin is worth less than it would cost to fill. Combine that with the emotional aspect of selling what might be a family heirloom, and you're left with a tricky situation to navigate. Dealers have to be delicate without being dishonest, and that's doubly true when there's something apparently precious involved. Carl was a master at that sort of thing. If a visitor had something to sell, he'd instantly assess whether or not it was an item that Denis would want. If it wasn't, he'd warmly engage with the person, either sending them to another dealer or explaining why their item wouldn't be purchased. Even in the case of that latter option, he would always manage to make them smile, and more often than not, they'd be excited to keep whatever they'd brought in. I took over that role whenever Carl was otherwise occupied, and I'd like to think that I did a decent job. With that being said, one of my failures turned out to be a defining moment. It was a busy Saturday, so Carl, Denis, and I were all fending for ourselves, and I took the initiative when a woman brought in some old silverware. She was clear about hoping to get quite a bit for it, but as I looked through what she had, I saw that it was mostly mismatched silver plate. In other words, what she thought was a costly collection was worth maybe the price of a cheeseburger. There was one sterling spoon, but it was in 2 pieces, and I had to grit my teeth when I told her that she'd only be able to scrap it. Suffice it to say we were both disappointed. On my side, well, it was only a spoon, and not even a particularly old one, but I hated having to advise that it be melted. As my last effort to salvage the situation, I suggested that the woman turn the spoon's handle into a pendant. She thanked me, replied that she never wore necklaces, then left with her rejected merchandise. Denis, who could always overhear everything that happened in his shop, reassured me by saying that it had been a good idea, and he mentioned that he had once tried his hand at silversmithing. He even showed me a piece that he'd made, lightheartedly lamenting that it was old enough to count as vintage by that point. Carl offered some sympathy of his own, but we were still busy, so we all went back to work. What happened next is one of those events that makes my story resemble a badly written role-playing game. Less than an hour after my conversation about silverware, an actual silversmith stopped by. Somehow or other, the topic of her studio offering lessons came up, and by the end of the day, both Carl and Denis were encouraging me to enroll. Don't get me wrong, I'd been expressing interest in silver for months by that point. My nickname was evidence of that much, but the convalescence of coincidence was what finally pushed me to embrace it. A month later, I took my first course, and a month after that, I went insane. That's how Carl put it anyway. In less ominous terms, I started buying anything that was bound for the scrappers, then doing my best to either restore it or work it into a piece of jewelry. I won't claim that I was actually any good, but I got to the point where I could take custom jobs without feeling like a complete imposter. My real test came when a young woman bought a concho belt, basically a long strand of sterling medallions, and asked if she could have it resized. It was pretty small to begin with, which meant that I'd need to add 2 extra sections, and those would need to match the other ones. Again, I won't claim that the end result was perfect, but Carl was impressed enough to put the belt back on display while we waited for its owner. He soon came to regret that, and I'm only half joking. At the time, Carl was trying to collect a specific pattern of silverware, so whenever a piece came in, he'd buy it for himself. On one fateful day, though, we had a visitor who explicitly wanted a pickle fork turned into a pendant, and that pickle fork was in Carl's pattern. The only reason that she'd known to ask was because Carl had been singing the praises of the jester's silversmithing abilities, and now we were both faced with the ultimate antique dealer's dilemma. We could disappoint a customer, or we could destroy a perfectly good and personally coveted object. I did the job for free, and she let me keep the part that I didn't use. Carl begrudgingly admitted that it was good work, and the customer was happy, so we called it a success. I turned the second segment into its own pendant, and we kept it up for sale until we rearranged the displays. By then, though, I'd garnered a new nickname, and I decided to keep the item as a memento. My second moniker didn't spread nearly as fast as my first one had, but Carl insisted that I accept it nonetheless. I was the guy who lived down the hill from the shop, and I had murdered an innocent piece of sterling. So as a warning to other potential victims, I was the silver butcher of the Vale. I always make sure to tell people that the hyphen is important. After all, I'm a butcher of silver, not a butcher who is silver. If you ever run into Ken, he'll tell you that Silver Butcher came about after I tore apart a candlestick in a thrift store. Obviously, that isn't true. But the moment that inspired his claim is the tale of how the name finally stuck. Damn it. There's no specific standard for when a person can refer to themselves as an antique dealer. Both the fish and the linebacker use the term, and I tacked the word aspiring onto my title until Carl explicitly told me to stop it. He used to joke that we were comparable to the Sith in Star Wars. There's a master and an apprentice, and in order for someone new to enter the equation, one of them has to be defeated. To this day, he's still far more insightful and experienced than I am, but I did best him once. It happened because I was able to unravel a silkworm's thread and find the glimmer of truth that had prompted it. And appropriately enough, it was a thread that had been spun on the day that I'd purchased my chamber stick. As you may recall, Ken had spent a while trying to convince me that a wooden piece of 70s-era statuary was actually an exciting item. During that same conversation, he had warned me to be wary of certain pickers. I'd never heard the term before, so I'd asked him to explain, and he'd told me a bunch of stuff that I'd later learned had been either exaggerated or completely made up. One detail had stuck in my memory, though. According to Ken, there were dozens of pickers who weren't interested in buying things, but who did enjoy keeping those things away from other people. He'd said that if I went looking, I'd be able to find stashes throughout every thrift store in the area. Of course, Ken had actually been describing his own habit in that thrift store. Maybe it had been his way of bragging. He had apparently told Carl the same thing at one point, but by the time of that exchange, the dealer had already recognized the telltale signs of a silkworm. Since I hadn't known any better, I'd believed him, and I'd taken his advice. That was how I knew that Ken really did hide things on occasion. Basically, he'd come in, find a few objects that someone might want, then tuck them out of sight in an old dresser or something. Every week or so, the staff would stumble on his hoard and put everything back on the shelves, and he'd start over in a new location. Well, one evening after we'd closed up at the shop, Carl and I walked over to the thrift store. We often went picking together, and he would literally always find more than me. In fact, to this day, Josephine still teases me about the gargantuan silver tray that I completely missed, but that Carl swooped in and bought for only $10. Anyway, on this particular night, there was a lot of new inventory, but very little of it was interesting. Carl remarked that someone must have gone through and grabbed all of the good stuff, and although he wasn't being serious, it did lead me to wonder if Ken had started a new collection. The silkworm himself was conspicuously absent, meaning that he had probably stepped out for a smoke. That left me with a limited amount of time, so while Carl made his rounds, I went to investigate the corner where the furniture was stored. And in the bottom drawer of a nightstand, I found a half-dozen items. Let me pause for a moment to share a bit of background. For centuries, silversmiths have weighted and reinforced hollowware items like candlesticks by filling them with something. It used to be pitch, but a kind of cement eventually became the preferred stabilizer. The silver itself is usually pretty thin, so unless damaged objects are old or special in some way, most people just scrap them. I'm telling you this because two of the items that I found were hollowware candlesticks from the 1960s, and they weren't in very good condition at all. One of them looked like it had been ripped down the middle, but all of the silver was still there. When I caught up with Carl and showed him what I'd discovered, he laughed and confessed that he'd never bothered to follow up on Ken's claims. In short, he had missed a resource that had been right in front of him, and as a result, I had finally come out on top. There was an item in the hall that Carl clearly wanted, and I was happy to let him have it. His way of thanking me was to scoff, "Oh sure, you only want the stuff that you can kill." Neither of us noticed that Ken had come back from wherever he'd been, but he'd seen us, and he walked up right as I was replying with, "Don't worry, it's definitely dead." I'm sure that Ken recognized the candlestick, just as I'm sure that he'd already seen the damage. That didn't stop him from smirking and asking if I'd been the one to destroy it. And Carl, never one to pass up a chance for humor, jumped in and said, "Of course he did. He's the silver butcher." If you ever want something repeated, say it in front of a silkworm. Fortunately, everyone knew better than to believe Ken's version of events, although one cashier did ask me what had really happened. It became a bit of an inside joke in the community, another piece of gossip and another nickname that brought some color to the village. I was and am still the jester, if only because that anecdote is more embarrassing. But to people like Carl and Denis, and to anyone who wears something that I made, I'm also the silver butcher of the Vale, and I have been since the night when I accepted a silkworm's quest, defeated my mentor, and became an antique dealer. The story that you just heard was true. I altered a few names and identifying details, so if someone like Ken wants to claim that I made something up, they have some plausible deniability. That village outside of time really exists though, and the antique shop on the hill still sits right at the center. It isn't the only one of its kind, but places like it are fairly few and far between. See, it isn't just that Denis has high standards or that Carl loves to teach. It's that everything within those walls is authentic. Every object is a real example of the best from a bygone age, and every conversation, no matter how brief, is founded on forming a genuine connection. There are pickers who stop by once a week or once a month, and there are locals who visit literally every day. Some of the gossip is a bit hard to believe, but even that helps outline the entrance to another world. It's a place where nicknames, classes, and alignments are parts of everyday life, where a good roll of the dice or the draw of the right card can lead to treasure, adventure, and genuine magic. That realm is hidden in plain sight, just waiting for the right person to walk in. And like I said at the beginning, if you're curious, observant, and just a little bit lucky, you can start writing your own story there.